Our next speaker is Miss Hani, and she's a lead educational therapist and an educational advisor with the Dyslexia Association of Singapore. She's here to present her research on dyslexia with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's a case study, it's a personal journey with one of her students. Hani's teaching experience includes teaching children with dyslexia with comorbidity, I'm going to call it comods, I can't pronounce that word, okay? Such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and specific language impairment. So I think Hani is ready, and I'm going to let her take over.
Thank you, Puma. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Okay, so my sharing today is based on my work with one of my students, and when I started working here at the DS, I've always had students with ADHD. And among all the students that I've had taught with ADHD, this particular student of mine was the most challenging but also the most memorable one. But before I begin, let me share a little bit of history. So when I was in school, many years ago, there was a boy in my class, my classmate. He was seen as the naughty one. Why was that? He couldn't sit still in class. He would always be walking around. He often blurted out answers even when the teacher was asking for someone else. He was also the joker of the class, always making people laugh, always instigating people to do naughty things with him. And apart from that, he often rocks in his seat. So his rocking can be quite incessant, such that he would knock the classmate behind him. So with all these actions that he displayed and the behavior that he displayed in class, it was no wonder that he was seen as someone naughty in the classroom. So that was many years ago, and as a young student at that time, I have never heard of the term ADHD. It was only when I started working here at the DS that I learned about what ADHD is all about. Okay, so what is ADHD? Now, the DSM-5 defines ADHD as a persistent pattern of inattention and/or hyperactivity that interferes with functioning or development, has symptoms presenting in two or more settings, such as the home, at school, with friends, with relatives and family, and usually it happens in all situations and in activities. ADHD has direct and negative impact on social, academic, and occupational functioning. Several symptoms must have been present before the age of 12. As we know it, ADHD, there are three types of ADHD. Firstly, predominantly inattentive, hyperactivity and impulsivity, and the combined type. The combined type would present the symptoms of inattention and hyperactive impulsive. The Conners Continuous Performance Test is used to ascertain for ADHD. This is a valuable assessment tool that can reveal important information about an individual's functioning, and especially helpful when a diagnosis of ADHD is being considered. It can also determine if the ADHD is on a mild, moderate, or severe on the scale. Right. So in the case of dyslexia and ADHD, when a student is diagnosed with both, which one is causing the learning difficulty? Is it the dyslexia that causes the student to misbehave, or is it the ADHD that causes the learning difficulty for the student? So based on studies done overseas, research shows that comorbidity exists between reading disability such as dyslexia and ADHD in 15% to 40% of the population. ADHD is estimated to occur in 3% to 5% of school-going children, and it is more common in boys than girls. Having a learning difficulty such as dyslexia is a challenge for any student. Now, when you have dyslexia and ADHD, it's a double whammy, because not only do you have a learning difficulty, but also a loss of concentration and inability to focus on anything for more than a few minutes. Okay, moving on to the subject of my presentation today. It's regarding this particular student that I worked with, Edwin, not his real name. So I started teaching Edwin when he was beginning primary 5. At this point, I had already known him because he's quite well known at the center. And why is that so? Our DS learning centers is not that big, and so when Edwin would come to class, he would just barge into the center, run across the corridor, and barge into his teacher's classroom. So, and at times when he ran across the corridor, he would be, what was that? Thank you. Okay, sorry. So when he ran across the corridor or when he entered the learning center, he would make a lot of noise. He would sometimes shout for his classmate's name. And when I heard that in my classroom, I would know that Edwin is already at the center. Yeah, so that's how everybody at the center, teachers, admin, colleagues know about him. His behavior is so obvious that you will not miss him at the center. However, on the other hand, Edwin could be quite endearing. He is polite. He would often say please and thank you. He was friendly. He would talk to anyone, any teachers at the center. He would even strike up conversation with any students. And he was also helpful at times. So when I had to inherit him from another teacher, I didn't feel that it was such a painful thing. Okay, so that's what Edwin is. He displayed a lot of the typical traits. At the beginning, he was diagnosed with dyslexia because he was displaying a lot of the dyslexic traits such as struggling with phonics, difficulty reading, and he started on the DS program at primary 1. So over the years, his learning difficulty got more and more challenging, and at primary 5, Edwin was diagnosed with ADHD. So using the Conners continuous performance test, he was rated at 98% on the scale. So 98% means that's very severe. So his severity happens to be in the hyperactive and impulsive category. Besides that, he was also diagnosed with amblyopia, which is lazy eye, and was found to have visual tracking issues. Like that was not bad enough. He was also diagnosed with Mears-Ellis syndrome and was prescribed tinted glasses to help him with reading. So Edwin is the typical ADHD kid. He displayed many of the traits listed here. For example, in my classroom, he could not be seated for long because he was always walking. My classroom was quite small, is still quite small. And he would just walk around, and because he's impulsive, he would touch a lot of my things, even though he knows that he shouldn't be doing so. He could not focus for long on tasks and often left them incomplete. Sometimes it could be easy to get him to work on something, but it wasn't easy to get him to focus for very long because he would then get up from his seat and walk around the class. He often blurted out answers even when I called for others to answer the questions. He disliked doing a lot of writing, especially composition and comprehension, where there's a lot of reading to be done and a lot of answering of questions. So with all those behaviors that he displayed in my classroom, it could get a bit exasperating working with him. And for some of you who might have worked with students with ADHD, I think you can understand what I'm talking about. He could hardly complete tasks most of the time, and I had to frequently direct him back to do his work. You see, what can be quite frustrating for me was that I know he's smart. He's got above average to high cognitive ability. Despite all his challenges, he's got pretty high IQ. So the frustrating thing was that I know he would be able to do something, but he had all these inhibitions that prevented him from doing the work that he had to do. So it was easy to make him understand concepts that I was teaching because he's smart. He grasped concept very easily, and when I throw verbal questions to the class, he would always be the first one to answer. So that made me pleased with him. But on the other hand, when I wanted him to do work or do worksheets, that's a different story altogether. So I can be pleased with him for answering questions verbally when I wanted to assess his understanding, but the next moment I can get quite annoyed and frustrated because he wouldn't want to do any worksheet activity. Indeed, with all the challenges that Edwin was facing, he had many difficulties in school. He did not perform well in school tests and exams despite his above average to high cognitive ability. He also displayed difficulties with executive functions such as difficulty maintaining effort. In this case, whatever that he started, he would not be able to complete it because he loses his attention and focus on the task very easily. He also had difficulty monitoring activities where if he were to start building something, he likes to build stuff using scrap paper, whatever materials that he could get from the classroom. But the interest did not last very long, so there was that difficulty in him to monitor whatever activity that he had embarked on. Now, with all these challenges that I faced with him in the almost in the first term of getting him in my class, I started to ask the question of how do I help this kid? He comes to see me only once a week. I had to do something to make him work and show some performance in my classroom, because in this case he not only had difficulty with literacy attainment, he also had difficulty managing his behavior. So I started to read up more on ADHD, and I learned about preference-based teaching. So preference-based teaching states that you weave in, incorporate, and include activities that the child likes or that the student likes in your classroom activity so that misbehavior is reduced and enhancement in learning is increased. So he would enjoy learning more and display less of the misbehavior that he used to. In the case of my student Edwin, he likes using the iPad and he also likes playing with PSP. So I incorporated the iPad into my lesson. One example would be instead of writing, which is something that he really, really detested, I made him type on the iPad any sentences or a short paragraph that I want him to do as part of my writing activity in the class. Besides preference-based teaching, I also employed the ABC model. ABC stands for antecedent, behavior, and consequence. So what this model suggests is that for the antecedent strategies, we should create a situation that would encourage the child to show good behavior. And when that behavior is shown, which is the behavior that you expected of him, there would be a consequence to it. So in this case, my antecedent strategy with him was to set specific rules to him. For example, be seated during cut drill, reading and spelling. These are the basic activities that we do in the classroom. So he had to be seated when we do these 3 activities. And if he were to show that he could be seated, that's my expected behavior of him. If he could show that he could be seated during these 3 activities, the consequence will be a positive reinforcement. And in his case, I reward him with points. So the points work out to be 1 point for the effort that he put in to be seated, and 1 or 2 more points for the completion of task that I had told him to do. Okay, so an example, this is how the ABC model looked like. Specific rules, such as sitting quietly and nicely during cut drill, reading and spelling. So the behavior that I expect of Edwin is that there is no rocking of chair during these activities. And his reward will be the points that I gave him and also specific praise. So I always tell him that, good job, Edwin, you actually sit down throughout these 3 activities. Or another one would be reduction of task. For example, he hates writing, and I do not employ, or rather, I do not use the iPad and get him to type all the time. At times, I still want him to write, because at the end of the day, when he goes back to school, he would still need to write a composition. So, in order to get him to do that, I would give him fewer words to write. So, for example, if the rest of the class writes 2 paragraphs, then he would write only 1 paragraph. And by writing 1 paragraph, he would be writing fewer words than the other students. And his reward, if he managed to write 1 paragraph that I wanted, his reward would be getting to play on the iPad during his break time. Again, there would be points given for effort and work completion. Okay, so it's also important to note that it's not always positive consequence. Sometimes the consequence can also be negative. And of course, he's not always good all the time. And at times he still gets into his mischief. And that's when I would deduct points from him. Okay, so these are some of the things that I use with him: the iPad, or at times the computer if he didn't bring the iPad, for him to do writing. Tangle for him to fidget with. Again, we know from research that with a lot of ADHD students, sometimes giving them something to fiddle with can help them to focus better and be more attentive to task. There are specific rules for him, and these rules were set up, this is of course not my rule, but they look something like this. So these rules were set up after negotiation with him. So it's not something that that's not something that I put up without his knowledge. It's something that we discussed about and he agreed upon. So the rules came about in that manner. And the points that he collected in every lesson, he would accumulate them at the end of every lesson and indicate them in his point score sheet. Okay, so apart from that, there are also other strategies that I employed in the classroom, such as teaching accommodation. Teaching accommodation with Edwin was something like writing fewer words for composition, fewer worksheets. So in order to assess his learning, I do not give him worksheets all the time. Sometimes I make them into game. I give the class quizzes, games such as bingo when we do reading, spelling, or word hunt when we do reading. And he likes doing such things. So such things are employed like a novelty. It doesn't happen in every lesson, but as and when. So it is something to entice him, something to make him look forward during class. In school, one of the teaching accommodation that he received was to be given an A3 size paper. Edwin had some difficulty with handwriting as well. His handwriting is usually quite messy and big, so he's given A3 size paper for homework and also during tests and exam. In my class, I do not quite use the A3 size paper, but I made sure that there are more white spaces and the blanks are wider so that he could write better. Homeschool communication. This happened between Edwin's mother and I. Very often we would text each other. His mother would text me to let me know of the feedback that his school teacher gave, and I would also text Mom to tell her about how Edwin was in my class for that particular day. Now, by sharing with me what happened in school, I could understand better what Edwin went through in the whole week, because he came to see me every Saturday, and he would have gone through school Monday to Friday. So sometimes bad things happen to him, sometimes good things happen to him. So when Mom told me about it, I could talk to him about it on Saturday when he came to see me. And when he shared with me what happened, I was able to advise him. Because most of the time, ADHD students, because of their behavior, they might be misunderstood by people. Self-regulation strategies. With him, I told him quite a bit about what I wanted or what acceptable behavior is in a classroom setting or in a social setting, and I would want him to take note of these behaviors. And for it to be structured and clear to him, I created a behavior chart where specific behaviors which are acceptable in any social setting is written down. So he would, and this is always put in front of him whenever he comes for class. And he would have to take note through this behavior chart of how he should behave in the classroom and put a tick next to the behavior that he had displayed. So again, with all this tick that he accumulated, he would be given points accordingly. And with a lot of teaching strategies, reward system sometimes works best. And with him, the points that he collected at the end of my class, he is converted to cash when he goes home. So at the end of every lesson, I would text his mom to tell her how many points he collected for that day. Now, this reward system is very effective for Edwin, but again, we have to take note that giving cash as a reward is not always a good thing, and it may not always be a good thing for everybody. Any kind of reward that we give to students should be meaningful and have value to the student. Okay, so I started writing this article after Edwin graduated. And in writing this article, I reflected on how it all began for me. And the question that I had was, what do we tackle first when we have a student with dyslexia and ADHD? Do we tackle the learning behavior first, or do we tackle do we tackle the learning difficulty first, or do we tackle the behavior challenge first? There was also the academic expectations. Remember, he came to me at primary 5, and at primary 5, that is the beginning of encouraging the student and motivating the student to put in a lot of hard work in preparation for the primary school living examination at primary 6. So when he came in at primary 5, I felt added pressure on me to help him improve on his literacy attainment and also changing some of his misbehavior. But with that, there's also parents' expectations of him. His parents had wanted him to go to the express stream. Therefore, we had a discussion during parent-teacher meeting and listed down all the options for Edwin after PSLE. So then mom and dad was more able to accept whatever the outcome of his PSLE was. In the end of it, I thought that my relationship with Edwin and his parent was one of the major factors that helped me to work better with him. So relationship, rapport with parents when we work with such children are very important. So eventually my conclusion was, well, that 2 years that I had with Edwin when I was teaching him at primary 5 and primary 6, it was very challenging, but it was a challenge in a good way. It made me a better teacher. It made me a more confident teacher when dealing with students with misbehavior. So again, family support, I think I cannot emphasize this enough. With the kind of students that we are working with, those with learning difficulty, behavior challenges, I think family support is most important. To all my fellow educators and as well as parents, work hand in hand together and support and encourage the children, because at the end of the day, there's always hope and there's always potential in the child. Okay, so where is Edwin now, you might wonder. It's been 2.5 years since he graduated from the program, and he's currently at secondary 3. He did very well for his primary school living examination. He's got a B for English, B for science, and A for maths. So any child has potential to succeed. Sometimes the success is not in academic way, but the success can be in a way you transform the child from that person who moves around and runs around in the class to someone who can be seated for a good 30 minutes in your class. Okay, so with that, I end my presentation. For the full article, it is available in the APJDD Volume 1, Number 2, and the handbook, Dyslexia Handbook, DAS Handbook 2014. Thank you.